can one say after all of that? You'll allow me a couple words. Actually, a good homily really should comment on the gospel that you've just heard. I'm going to comment on a gospel that you will hear in 3 days from now, on Wednesday of this coming week. It's a great story, you've heard it before, the story of the Emmaus disciples. You know, the day after Easter morning, after Jesus has died and been put in the tomb, the two of his disciples have left Jerusalem and they're going back to Emmaus, discouraged, dispirited, defeated, disappointed. And lo and behold, Jesus walks along with them. And he helps them to understand what has just transpired in Jerusalem. And he does this by taking the scriptures and going back in the Hebrew scriptures to help them see that the Messiah would have to die. The Messiah would carry the sins of his people, suffer under that weight, and be killed, and then rise again. So what the Emmaus disciples do, we've been doing for the past, I won't say how long, for the past few minutes. We in fact have been all week long, and especially now tonight, have been rereading Israel's history. We've heard just a part of the story tonight. From chaos at the beginning of time to cosmos, to an ordered universe that God looked at and said, it is really good. From slavery in Egypt, deliverance, and the promise of a new land. From the complaints and unbelief of the people to mercy and forgiveness. From infidelity and betrayal, the return from exile, and a love rediscovered. In rereading their history, this is what the Israelites saw. Moses told them, as he was instituting the celebration of Passover, he said, I want you to celebrate the Passover every year and tell your children why you are celebrating the Passover. And I quote, lest you forget that the Lord brought you out of slavery, lest you forget. Remember all of this, lest you forget. And so at Passover time and tonight, we painfully recall the sin and the infidelity of God's people. But in so doing, we are remembering God's abiding care and tender mercy. Thursday night, Deacon Paul invited us to reflect on the importance of remembering. I thought that was such a great idea, I decided to steal it. And say a couple other words about it in the context of the readings that we have just heard. Remembering was good for Israel. It's also good for us. We need to remember. Maybe close your eyes for a moment. Remember in your own life those moments of suffering and confusion. times maybe when you've made hurtful and damaging decisions. When perhaps even you might have experienced some forms of slavery or addiction. As you remember those things, also remember the deliverance that you experienced. I tried this week, by the way. So not just tonight, but during the week, I made this effort to try to remember those moments in my own life of infidelity and suffering. I have to admit, it was not easy. I did spend a lot of time focusing on the infidelity and the suffering. I had a hard time getting beyond it, and perhaps if you risk remembering, you might also end up focusing on those things. But then, the more attentive I was to those things, I also began to focus on moments of deliverance. They were very concrete. I'm not going to get into details. Be a little bit personal. See me afterwards if you want to talk about it. God's love was manifested to me in very concrete ways. In conversations with a friend. God's wisdom was revealed to me through the love and good counsel of a wonderful mentor that I had. I experienced God's forgiveness through a psalm, a very specific psalm, Psalm 74, that shed new light on the suffering that I was experiencing and gave me hope. So remember the moments of suffering and infidelity. Remember the moments, too, of deliverance and how that came about. Give it a try this week. Don't simply stop at the suffering, the sinfulness, the mistakes, but I'm confident you'll discover more than that. Why do it? Why is remembering so important? I can think of a couple of reasons. There are probably a number of others, but I can think of a couple. First of all, remembering our failings, this is counterintuitive, but remembering our failings is actually a healthy thing to do. It's actually important to kind of look at ourselves honestly and see ourselves for who we are, even in those bad moments. It's good to acknowledge what we have been, not to wallow in it, but to recall how much we depended on God's grace. We just could not do it alone. We needed God's grace. Remembering those difficult moments will also remind us of how critical it was that He was present in our life. Second reason why I think remembering is so important. By remembering those moments, we can experience once again the love of God that we experienced at those times and become perhaps more understanding and loving of other people when they are going through their difficulties. So I think remembering, at least for those two reasons, is extremely important. So tonight, we've remembered Israel's slavery and sin, saw how God delivered them. Israel's story, I think, reveals a God to us who himself, without reserve, loves his people. And this is a story that culminates on Calvary. It goes that far. We've been reminded tonight of Christ's passion and death. He experienced on the cross all the pain that sin inflicts, but in the end, it did not defeat him. So Easter proclaims that what we think of as defining our lives, sickness, slavery, death, any number of wounds, is not in fact final. God's grace heals us now and sets aside everything that could destroy the joy that should be at the center of our lives. Easter says that liberation from slavery is possible. The hope it gives makes it possible for us to face our own suffering and guilt and to remember God's tender embrace.